Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Welcome, Brian, the guest speaker for today. Welcome, Glenn, and all the participants that are coming online. In terms of housekeeping, please be aware that we want you to mute your mic. If you have any questions, there's a chat section where you can write your questions, and Glenn and I will monitor that, and we'll read out the questions to Brian. Uh, in order to save bandwidth and avoid some hiccups with some of the participants, please close your video, except Brian. Of course, we want to see him, and his face will be part of the video as we record it. And I just mentioned that you should post all your questions in the chat box, and we'll be looking out for those questions. So in terms of what is the purpose of all these live sessions, as you all know, we want to enrich the exchange, the conversation as we move forward. So for each one of the modules, we invite somebody that we feel that has some background knowledge that will help us enhance the content that we are discussing. You will also notice that as news or new information comes out, we post it in the corresponding discussion forum, and we also add complementary resources to each one of the sections. Over this week in particular, we have shared a couple of news that you might find interesting, and that Brian might be able to respond to some of the positions posted on those messages or those latest articles or research or news. As I mentioned, all the live sessions will be available in 24 to 48 hours after we finish it. In the course, it'll be available 1 hour after the session, more or less. We expect Brian to tell us how he wants to deal with questions and answers. I don't know if he wants us to interrupt him or not. He'll tell us that when he has the floor. And as I mentioned, we will have a short survey available at the end of this session so that you can share your experience with us regarding this live weekly session. I would also like to mention that those that have completed the course, completed all the quizzes, and got your certificate, it would be very important that you print out that certificate, because it has a unique identifier on the bottom right side, and that is important if someone wants to verify that you completed this course. So please print it out and have it available before we conclude this course, which is set to end on November 14th, if I recall correctly. And why will it end on November 14th? Because we start a new cohort the week after, and we need to reset everything for that group. So in terms of what's going to happen next week, let me mention that next week we're going to have as a guest speaker Joanna Gulesa. She's from Poland. She's also a lawyer. She teaches at the University of Lutz International Law in the context of internet governance. So it's going to be a very interesting session as well. She works besides her job as a university legal professor. She also is a volunteer in the at-large community, and she represents Europe in the at-large advisory committee. So this week, as I mentioned, we're going to have Brian Cimbolic. I hope I pronounced the last name right. If not, well, he'll tell us. And he's going to be talking about DNS abuse and other topics related with security and data protection and privacy, I hope. So having said that, let me give Brian your privileges So the floor is yours, Brian.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, and thank you, Glenn, as well, for having me. I'm excited to be here to speak about DNS abuse. My name is Brian Cimbolic. I am the Vice President and General Counsel at Public Interest Registry. PIR, we're best known for operating the .org top-level domain. As well as managing the legal affairs of PIR, I also oversee our anti-abuse program. Today, we're going to be speaking about DNS abuse in a few ways. First, what is it? Why is it important? And then also some initiatives that we at PIR have introduced, as well as some industry-wide efforts aimed at stemming the tide of DNS abuse between both GTLD, generic top-level domain operators, country code operators, and domain name registrars. By the way, housekeeping of my own, feel free to ask questions in the chat. If I miss them, I'll sort of keep an eye on the chat as I'm presenting, but I admittedly may miss some. So I'm sure there is a dedicated question time at the end that if anything pops up that I miss, happy to discuss then as well. So DNS abuse, why is it important? And it is important, and it seems to be a topic of increasing concern across a number of constituencies for internet governance. Recently, in the fall of 2019, the Government Advisory Committee, the GAC, issued a public statement. And for those of you that many of you will know, some of you may not, the GAC is a consortium of governments from around the world that advises the ICANN board on policy matters or on internet governance matters. And they put out a statement about DNS abuse. And they said that protecting the public from security threats and DNS abuse is an important public policy issue. If the public is to trust and to rely upon the internet for communications and transactions, those tasked with administrating the DNS infrastructure must take steps to ensure that this public resource is safe and secure. And so that's something that it's a real call to action and a call to arms. It's something that a number of registries and registrars have been taking abuse very seriously, but it was an eye-opening moment for the industry as a whole. Slide. So that's sort of the importance of DNS abuse. But what is DNS abuse? Generally speaking, the definition that the contracted party house, so meaning registries and registrars in the GTLD space, as well as the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network and the framework to address abuse, all sort of coalesce around one definition of DNS abuse. And it's technical abuse of the DNS in 5 ways. There's malware, so malicious software installed on a device without the user's consent. There's botnets, and these are internet-connected computers that have been infected with malware. Basically, it's part of a command and control network. This has recently, or at least the shift with botnets has really turned to domain-generating algorithms, which we'll speak to later, which create potentially tens of thousands of domains to propagate a command and control network to do things like DDoS attacks. Phishing, I'm sure many of you are aware, phishing is tricks a victim into revealing sensitive information. So you think you're going onto your bank's website to check your bank account, but really it turns out that it's a lookalike site intended to trick you into providing your credentials. And farming is the redirecting of users to unknown or fraudulent services, typically through DNS hijacking or poisoning. We also included in this is spam, and spam unto itself is not really DNS abuse. It's annoying and it's illegal in many things, but spam as it relates to DNS abuse is important because it can be a delivery mechanism for DNS abuse. In particular, if a link that includes malware or an email campaign directed at phishing. So spam is important, but as a category unto itself isn't really DNS abuse, but it can be an important delivery mechanism for DNS abuse. And I see there's a question that I'm going to come to, I'll come to at the end here. So the question, so when a registry or registrar identify DNS abuse? What can they do? Not necessarily even what should they do. Well, for registries in particular, because registrars sometimes act as the host, but for a registrar that's just providing registrar services, its tools are pretty limited in the same way that a registry are. So the only real option for a domain name registry or registrar when it identifies DNS abuse, to the extent it's going to take action on the domain name, is to suspend the domain name. And for the registrar, that happens by applying what's known as client hold. It's an EPP command that suspends the domain name. For a registry, it is by applying the server hold command at the EPP level. And so really those are, technical ways of saying that the light switch for the domain goes from on to off. So, and that's it. That's really the only thing that a registry or registrar can do, is suspending the domain name renders the domain name itself inaccessible via the DNS. So that knocks down all content associated with the site, and renders and also shuts down all mail records, so email associated with the site. So it really sort of is a nuclear option. And so there's questions that we're going to touch on a few times here around proportionality and collateral damage. But when you have a domain name that's dedicated to phishing, using the DNS to address that DNS abuse, that's a proportionate response. When you're dealing with something like a piece of content on a website, if you have a third level domain or one URL on a domain name, knocking down the domain name to address that one URL could cause immense collateral damage. So a registry and a registrar cannot remove, we don't have a scalpel to remove surgically remove a piece of content. It's just that blunt tool instrument of suspending the entire domain name. Alfredo's question about fake news, that's a great point. So if you're on a chat forum site and someone's propagating fake news, or a third level domain has fake news on it, there's really nothing that the registry or registrar can do short of knocking down the entire domain name, as well as all other legitimate content that might be on the site. So there's a graphic that we'll touch on later, but the principle really is that the entity that's closest to that content should be the one dealing with it. It's a principle known as subsidiarity when you're talking about political issues, but I think it holds true via the DNS. So a DNS operator can't remove a piece of content, where a website, where a hosting provider can, as well as a site operator. So those questions of content really should be dealt with at the hosting level and the site operator level, with a few exceptions that I'll get to. So this may be hard to see, and I'll pull up as I'm speaking the anti-abuse metrics that for PIR that we've seen in .org. These actually are only current through August, and we recently posted our more recent suspension metrics. So generally speaking, we have seen this year, and I'm going to look at the link I posted in the chat. Thus far, we have suspended a total of 2,686 domain names at the registry level and 1,400 domains at the registrar level. So oftentimes the way it works is someone will provide us with a claim of abuse. We will investigate with a team of security investigators. When we identify abuse at the registry level, we will work with the registrar, and it's important to do so for a few reasons. First, a very significant chunk of the domain name abuse that we see is actually compromised domains. And so what that means is, if I register a domain name and I'm putting it to legitimate use, and I am, not super careful with my passwords, or through most of the time through no fault of my own, someone gains control of the domain name, by guessing the credentials, figuring out how to log in and get control of the domain name. And then at that point, the domain is essentially hijacked and put to bad use. At that point, we don't want to suspend the domain name if we can help it. What we want is for the registrar to work with the registrant to get the domain name back in the hands of the legitimate domain name user. Bill asks, why is there no called out category for farming? It's included in our other category, Bill. It's something that has been sort of on the decline. 5-6 years ago, we saw many more instances of farming, but it's really not something that we come across much anymore, or at least not something that comes across our plate. The other thing that farming is sort of even though it is DNS abuse, it's the one category of abuse where acting via the DNS doesn't do much, because it's something that's happened on the local user's computer. So it's something that really has to be remediated outside of the DNS. So suspending the domain name isn't going to work, because, again, it's the person's getting rerouted to the site that they didn't intend to go to anyways. So the thing I want to call out here, so a couple things of interest, is the looking at the botnets. So you'll see in 2020 so far, we've suspended 86,000 domain names for botnets. You'll see that's a huge increase from 2019, and you may think to yourself, like, oh my gosh, is this a problem? Should we be concerned? Well, of course, botnets in general are a problem across the DNS, but interestingly, that 86,000, that's from one court order. And so it gives you a sense of the sophistication of these domain generating algorithms. That the way that it works is that there's often it's domain generating algorithms are just that, is that there is an algorithm that generates domain names as part of a command and control botnet. And for this one domain generating algorithm, the good guys or law enforcement, cybersecurity researchers, certs, they figure out what that algorithm is, realize what the domains are that are going to be propagated to do bad things. And so we then cooperate with law enforcement or certs and actually go in and create those domain names before the algorithm can. So it sort of breaks the chain. So that was one court order that in .org alone, we had 86,000 domain names. And I know that we weren't the only top level domain that participated in that. So I think, the scale of domain generating algorithms has gone, they're massive. So the other thing I wanted to touch on this slide is when I say that, generally speaking, the DNS isn't the appropriate venue to deal with issues of website content abuse. We at PIR, we've published our anti-abuse principles, and it's sort of how we approach domain name abuse. And there's one of the cornerstones of that is the weighing of proportionality and collateral damage. And so, and the scale of harms. And when you're talking about something like child sexual abuse, the scale of harms is very high. So we've put in place a system where we work with the Internet Watch Foundation, where they identify child sexual abuse imagery on sites on .org domain names and notify us. We then work with the registrar and the registrant to get that content removed. We can't do it. Like I said, the only thing we can do is suspend or not suspend the domain name, but we can work with the registrar, escalate, and ensure that the content gets removed. Now, that's not always successful. So year to date, there have been 47 unique domain names that have had child sexual abuse materials on them. Whoops, I'm sorry, did I zoom in? Sorry about that. Down here, sorry about that. There have been 47 domain names that have had child sexual abuse imagery on them. And our process has worked in that we were able to get that content removed in 42 of those 47 cases. In 5 cases, we had to ultimately suspend the domain because the registrant either refused to or would not remove the child sexual abuse imagery. So applying our anti-abuse principles, we, after a period of 96 hours, multiple notifications, weren't able to get the content removed, so ultimately had to suspend the domain name to address the child sexual abuse imagery. So in mentioning our anti-abuse principles, the other cornerstone of that was due process. So what happens when a domain name is suspended? Most registries and registrars, they'll let you email them, but at the end of the day, the decision is relatively final. So we've worked with, and Paul Diaz, who's on the call, can speak to our coordination with Article 19 and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. But one of the recommendations they had was that we institute a redress mechanism for domain name registrants in the event that a domain name is suspended. This is also really consistent with the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. So I&J, as I'll refer to them. I&J has, in their operational approaches document that I shared with Glenn, that he shared with the course, really recommended that registries and registrars maintain an appeal process so that registrants can challenge decisions based on suspensions for domain name abuse. But for us, due process means more than just asking us, the entity that suspended the domain name for abuse in the first instance, coming and asking us to reverse ourselves isn't really a robust due process right, in our opinion. So we will work with registrants and we will reverse our decisions if a registrant, if we think there's a credible allegation that a domain name was compromised versus maliciously registered, we will reverse ourselves, put the domain back in the hand of the registrant, but then monitor the domain to ensure that there isn't a resurgence of domain name abuse. But what happens in the event that we don't decide to reverse? What if we're wrong both in our application of our policy and our consideration of the appeal? We recently announced that we're working with Forum, previously the National Arbitration Forum, in implementing an anti-abuse appeal mechanism. So the price of that is $1,200 for the appeal. PIR subsidizes $700 of that $1,200. And then the registrant, the appellant, bears $500. But if that appeal is successful, then the registrant recovers its entire fee and we reinstate the domain. The other thing I want to point out here is that part of the process, you can't write to that formal challenge and incur fees. We want people to come talk to us to see if we made a mistake. So that part of the challenge where you come and say, you suspended my domain name, I think you were incorrect or you applied your policy wrong. That part is built in as a necessary step and is free of charge. So, no one has to go through this process. But to the extent that you do go through the formal challenge process, there's a free mechanism available to you before you go to this neutral third party. The other thing I want to touch on this is that the publication of the appeal mechanism does not represent an expansion of our anti-abuse anti-abuse policy. It doesn't mean we're expanding into new areas of website content or anything. All this does, it just creates a new right for .org registrants that didn't exist previously to have your suspension, have our application of our policy reviewed by a neutral third party. And we, across the GTLD space, this is a pretty novel approach. There's a handful of CCTLDs that have something like this in varying forms, but we're the first TLD in the GTLD space to have something like this in place. So those were, that was a PIR specific, PIR specific initiative, but there's also, many actors across the DNS take abuse very seriously. And one of the things that was announced, I'm not sure if you saw, but last October, we announced the framework to address abuse. And that started out with 11 signatories, but now is more than 50 registries and registrars. And when I say registries, both in the GTLD space, so PIR, DONA, New Star, which is now GoDaddy Registry, Filius, a number of large gTLD operators, as well as Nominet in the ccTLD space, a few other smaller ccTLDs, and all of the largest domain name registrars participate in this. So GoDaddy, CentralNick, 2Cows, Namecheap, the list goes on and on. You can go to dnsabuseframework.org to see the current list of participants. And what this really stands for is two broad categories. Is one, when must a domain name registry or registrar take action? And two, when should a registry and registrar take action? Now, the must here isn't from a contractual requirement perspective, but more of a sense of stewardship and responsibility. So the ccTLD, for instance, that signed on to this framework don't have a registry agreement with ICANN. They signed on to this because they think it's the right thing to do, that registry operators, when they identify DNS abuse, must take action for the safety and benefit of the DNS. Now, the should categories, well, I'll get to in a moment, but they're the really egregious categories of website content abuse. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead to a slide and then come back. So the should categories, when should a registry or registrar take action on website content abuse? There's 4 categories. One, which I've touched on already, is child sexual abuse materials. Everyone can sort of agree that this is the worst of the worst on the internet. And so even though we have sort of a blunt tool instrument to deal with questions of abuse, the scale of harms when you're talking about something like CSAM is high enough that it warrants application if you're unable to get the content removed with either the site operator or the hosting provider. Same is true as illegal distribution of opioids online, instances of human trafficking, and specific and credible incitements to violence. Oops. Now, what's important to know is that when should a registry and registrar act on things of on questions of website content abuse, they should only act if there's sort of what we would call an exhaustion of remedies. That means that if someone has located CSAM, child sexual abuse materials, they should first try to contact the site operator, the registrant, or the hosting provider, because those are the entities that can remove a particular image. They can remove one URL. They can take action to address the questionable content without affecting the rest of the domain name. So to the right of the line, where you've got registries, registrars, and to a lesser extent resellers, we cannot do anything about CSAM other than flag it for the registrant or site operators, and if they don't take action, suspend the domain name. And again, the reason that we always have to be cognizant of the collateral damage. So using the example of Craigslist on .org. So Craigslist.org is one of the most popular domains on the entire DNS. If there's someone posts one offering of selling narcotics or child sexual abuse material, and by the way, we never actually run into problems with Craigslist. They have robust enforcement policies, so this is just purely a hypothetical. But just to paint a picture as to the scale of collateral damage that could happen, if we were to take action on Craigslist.org for one post, that would render hundreds of millions of legitimate pieces of content of people looking for roommates, of offering things for sale, of just legitimate online activities that, because of the nature of the DNS, if we were to take action, would render them all inaccessible on the DNS. So it's a great responsibility that registries and registrars have to be mindful of the scale of harms, but also the other side of that is the collateral damage that can occur when you use the DNS to address questions of website content abuse. So for instance, last year with PIR, we suspended, I think it was 6,000 6,000 domain names for DNS abuse, farming, malware, botnets, phishing, and spam when it's a delivery mechanism. We suspended a total of 11 domain names, juxtaposing, the scale of DNS abuse versus website content abuse actions. 8 of which were for child sexual abuse materials, 3 of which were dedicated exclusively to the sale of opioids online. So, there was a site that was buynorco, which is an opioid.org. And you could only go to that site and do one thing. You could buy Norco online. And so the scale of harms in that instance was high, and there was no collateral damage to taking action on the domain name. So in that instance, we determined that it was appropriate for us to suspend the domain name after there was no remediation by the registrant or the registrar. One thing I want to touch on briefly, and it's something that you hear a lot in ICANN land, is the increased reliance on trusted notifiers. So by nature, domain name registries and registrars are not experts on, locating and finding illegal content around the world. That's not our job, nor should it be. But once you've made a determination that something is so egregious that it rises to the nature of taking action at the DNS, it's important to work with expert organizations that do have that expertise. This is also pretty similar to some of the work that we do in the DNS abuse world. So we rely on more than a dozen reputation block lists, so RBLs, that kind of go across the DNS and which is, sorry, I'm getting messages here saying I joined. So just in a nutshell, we work with a few organizations as trusted notifiers. One is the Internet Watch Foundation, which is the InHope network for the United Kingdom. And so the InHope network is a consortium of, I think it's 44 hotlines around the world that are responsible for locating child sexual abuse imagery in their jurisdiction. The IWF is sort of unique in that they offer a service called Domain Alerts, where they will provide us with a daily list of all identified CSAM that they've located in .org. We also work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the hotline operator for the United States. And finally, and for those two, that is for identifying child sexual abuse imagery on .org. Finally, we have a trusted notifier relationship in place with the United States Food and Drug Administration for identifying sites that are distributing opioids online. Now, unlike the IWF and NCMEC, where technically it would be illegal for us to access the reports they send to us, we have a step in place with the FDA where they say that this site is engaged in distribution of opioids online. And then we make a determination, is this primary purpose of the site distribution of opioids? So using the Craigslist example, if someone posts something on Craigslist for distribution of opioids online, one, Craigslist robust, enforcement mechanisms would have that taken down. But two, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to use the DNS to suspend all of Craigslist.org. So we have to make a determination, is this site on this domain name, is its primary purpose distribution of opioids online? And only if the answer to that question is yes, would we then institute our procedures that would end up with a suspension of a domain name. One last thing I wanted to speak to is another initiative that we're really proud of at PIR, and it's called our QPI, the Quality Performance Index. And what this is, it's intended to incentivize responsible domain name registration. So obviously all registries and registrars are interested in growing their base of registrations. Well, it's somewhat easy to increase. If you wanted to inflate your numbers, you just drop your prices super low and you're going to get a lot of registrations. The problem is very little of them are going to renew, and you're going to see a huge increase in domain name abuse because the bad guys out there that are interested in propagating a phishing campaign or distributing malware, they're looking for cheap domain names. They're not interested in spending a lot of money to do this. They want the biggest bang for their buck. So when we think about our incentive programs for our registrars, we want to be really cognizant of not having programs that incentivize abuse. And in fact, rewarding registrars that have responsible registration. So it's sort of a carrot and stick approach. So we have a scoring system for all of our registrars based on a number of variables that I'll speak to in a moment. And if you are performing well, then you'll get a discount on the registrar receives a discount on its registration. And because one, to incentivize good registrations, but two, to help responsible growth of .org. But then it's the stick aspect of it is that registrars are competitive. And so if a registrar with high abuse numbers, meaning they're not getting a discount from us, they know that they are paying more for .org than the high performing registrars on issues like abuse. So this is, it's something we launched last year and it's grown. So in the Q3 of 2020, 48% of all of our registrations, of all of our new creates, I should say, came about of the QPI program. So those are registrars that are receiving discounts because we vetted them on a number of criteria. And we've seen our abuse numbers stay consistently low, the lowest of all GTLDs. And we're really incentivizing smart, responsible registrations. So what are the things that we score on? The biggest one is abuse. So what is the abuse rate for the domain name registrar? So not the raw number of abuse, because if you think of the bigger registrars out there, of course, if a registrar has 20% of all of our registrations or 5% of all registrations, you would expect, even if they're very responsible and have a low percent of abuse, you would expect that number would be, the raw number would be higher than a small registrar. So we look at basically the percent of their creates that are abusive. And if they don't hit our threshold, it doesn't matter what the other criteria are, they're out the door. They don't qualify for QPI if they have high abuse. Even the other factors are DNSSEC enabled, site usage, SSL certificates, renewal rates. And this is something that we iterate. We think about, has this been working? Do we need to change this? But the one thing that has been constant is our focus on abuse. And actually, when we launched it, abuse rate was the highest weighted of the factors, but it wasn't a gating mechanism. And we thought that wasn't right. The spirit of this is to make sure that registrars, if they have high abuse rates, don't get incentives. We're incentivizing low abuse registrations. And this is something that's really sort of taken off. We've presented this at ICANN a number of times. They've been very receptive. The Public Safety Working Group, which is a contingency of the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee, called this a registry best practice. And they encourage other registries to implement something like this. And it's something that we're totally open to that. PIR is a nonprofit. Part of our mission is to be an exemplary domain name registry. And that's one way, this is one way we're doing it. So any registry or registrar that's interested in doing this, we'd encourage them to contact us, because we think it helps both a business perspective in that, yes, we're increasing registrations, but doing so in a really responsible way. And so we're trying to find that balance. And we think that we're achieving that right now with QPI. And so I wanted to be sure to save some time for questions. And I'm sorry, the chat questions got away from me as I was presenting. So I don't know if Glenn or Alfredo were tracking exactly.
Yeah, Brian, it's Glenn. I just want to test my audio again. I changed my headset. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. I want to just I'll go back to the other questions in sequence, but I wanted to ask. You're very proud of the new QPI, and with good reason to be. And as you said, GAC identified it as a best practice. Do you think ICANN will change based on this concept that you have here on the QPI? Do you think it will compel the other organizations to follow suit? Do you think this best practice will be enshrined into the registry contractual relationship with ICANN?
It's a good question, Glenn, and one that's interesting. I believe, and it's acronym soup, but was it the CCTRT? And Glenn or Paul can probably correct my abbreviation recollection there, but they recommended something exactly like this, that that registries or registrars gain financial incentives with ICANN if they have low abuse rates. So, it's important to remember that when someone registers a domain name, yes, they register it with the registrar pays the registry, but then the registry and registrar both pay ICANN on a per domain name basis. So those fees obviously add up. So we can say, now we're a year into this, QPI changes behavior. We've had, the good registrars are just getting incentives for doing what they're doing. That's great. And we're happy that they are, because we want to reward that good behavior. But we're also seeing, without naming names, a couple of registrars that have not been aggressive on abuse and did not enjoy good reputations on abuse that failed QPI in a quarter, because we assess on a quarterly basis, come to the table and say, what can we do? We're not getting the discount that these guys are, and it's bugging us. Like, fine, help us. How do we get better at abuse? And so we've had a number of sit-down conversations, say, okay, well, here, how are you handling it when you get referrals here? What are you relying on reputation block lists? What's your turnaround times when you get these things? And walking them through it and seeing huge improvements. So the registrars that have come to us in that manner, they're starting, recently one passed QPI for the first time because of the remediative steps that it took to really think about abuse in a more responsible way. So, I don't know, will something like this get instituted? I can't say. Has it been floated? Absolutely. And I sort of think the proof is in the pudding. For us, it's worked. We've increased our registrations and decreased our abuse rates. So I think it's a good concept that I think works in a number of ways.
Great, thank you, Brian. So just on that, it's a carrot and stick situation. It's basically ICANN has it has the tools to impose, but it's resident on doing that. I find in the past, but I think if you look at it from the end user point of view, and people seeing, when they decide on where to purchase a domain name and which registry. So perhaps the end user education is quite critical. And if you know that ALAC is actually, in the last number of ICANN meetings, they've been raising the awareness within the at-large community of this issue. Yeah. So you want to comment on that?
No, yeah, I mean, ALAC has been very, front and center on abuse questions, and we've had some really great conversations with you and Jonathan Zuck, and it's something that registries and registrars we take very seriously, especially those that have signed on to the framework. We recognize it's a problem, but one that we think we are handling responsibly, but always happy to have those conversations, because there's no getting around it. DNS abuse is a problem, but we think that there's ways that registries and registrars can borrow from each other's collective knowledge here and address the problem head on.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Alfredo. Question is, does the QPI impact lower prices for registrants, and do the end user services received?
So it shouldn't have actually, yes, to both. So QPI should benefit registrants in that it does it result in a couple ways. One, for those registrars that pass QPI, it provides a discount. And anytime a registry provides a discount to a registrar, the idea is that part of that gets passed on to the registrant. So for those registrars that are participating in QPI, it makes them more competitive by being able to offer lower prices. And as a result, the registrants end up paying less. It also, by having less abuse, is beneficial for the registrant, because end users and registrants are really the ultimate victims of DNS abuse. So if you put your credentials in a phishing site, then obviously you're harmed as the end user there. So by decreasing DNS abuse in .org, ultimately that has a real, there's 10.3 million domain names in .org. And so that it makes a real difference when we can decrease our abuse in a zone that size. It has a real tangible benefit to the registrant. And as we're encouraging other registries to participate, as others sign on to something like this, it just builds on top of itself. So if something like QPI was instituted across many top-level domains, then that means that registrants and end users are that much more protected, enjoy the benefit of lower prices for registrars that have responsible anti-abuse practices, and are less susceptible to things like phishing in the end.
Great, thank you. I want to ask people to ask another question. We have a couple more minutes for this session, and I just want to do a reminder. Make sure you fill out the very short survey that we have on the session upon completion. So it looks like Paul is saying, hi, Mike, Michelle. I hope you and all the other classmates are getting a lot out of the VSIG program. I hope so too. So we try very hard to bring in great speakers like Brian and others to have a particular. We can't cover the entire session on security, so we have to pick a topic, and that's a hot topic, that's a relevant topic. So this is extremely important for everybody to share our time with Brian today, and I appreciate it on an American holiday. So we have another question from Kapal. How do you build trust and cyber resilience strategy in the post-COVID-19 workforce, and work culture in digital ecosystem?
It's a good question. I think it's sort of a few of the initiatives I touched on really get to the heart of things where, it's incumbent upon, if PIR is one entity that does something, that's great. And it helps org registrants, but across the entire DNS, does it have a massive impact? No, it has an impact. Where it really starts to add up is when you have other participating to registries and registrars. That's why I think the framework to address abuse is so important, is because it represents a huge swath of registrations across the DNS. Maybe not, pretty big registries. So like I said, you've got org and .uk, which off the bat, that's close to 25 million registrations right there. But then you've got Newstar, affiliates. So on the GTLD side, it's a number of registrations, but on the registrar side, you've got the biggest registrars in the world signing their names onto essentially a pact to institute responsible domain name abuse mitigation practices. So that's where I think it really starts. That's how you build trust, is that not just these entities signing their names onto this, because I have no interest in something that's just lip service. It's the registrars that sign on to this and actually implement practices or change their practices to be more aggressive. So I think that's how the biggest instance of people building that trust in the last year, I think.
Great, thank you. Alfredo has asked a question. Do you see QPI or something similar incorporated in the new subsequent procedures, the sub-pro TLD round?
That's interesting. I have, it's not something, admittedly, Alfredo, I've specifically thought of. Nor am I advocating for it, frankly. I do think that QPI is something that would scale across DLDs, but as far as it being included as part of sub-pro, I can't specifically speak to. I do want to clarify one thing, by the way, that it's important to remember that a registry doesn't set prices. So when I say we provide a discount to the registrar, that is the discount that the registrar pays to us. So a registrar sets its own price. We can't, for actual legal reasons, we can't tell them you have to charge this across all registrations. That the actual price that the registrant pays is set by the registrar. But the idea is that by providing a discount for responsible registrar actors for DNS abuse, that some of that gets passed, some or all gets passed down to the registrant in its registration flow.
Great. Just looking for any other questions. I think we've covered most of them. And I think Rudy is typing one in. I just want to comment, for people to be kept informed, is there a section on the PIR website that details any developments on the QPI or any other articles? I recall, I think I saw one on Circle ID a short while ago. What's your recommendation?
Yeah, so we do have a couple blogs announcing QPI, and so it's a good question, and it's something that just as we post our anti-abuse metrics, I think you're going to see some similar transparency reporting around QPI, and especially now that we're a year in, what have we learned? What's worked, what hasn't worked. So there, I will share after this session some resources with the group on that.
Great, thank you. I'm just waiting for Rudy to finish typing up his opus here. I see him still typing. I'm anticipating his question. Rudy's based in a small set of islands, St. Vincent, and he's a part of the Paralympics team. He's involved with the ISOC chapter and seminal person. So, here he is. Excellent session. Thank you. It is my early Q application to this. It's my earlier question applicable to this session. Now I have to look for Rudy's question. Well, there he is. QPI is such a good concept. I hope other registries adopt it. I'm assuming that's his comment, but I don't see his other. But maybe it's wishful thinking that people would adopt a good practice, but everybody has their own marketing strategy, and if they're not forced to do this, they're not legally through ICANN to do this, right, Brian?
Yeah, that's true, but there's a lot of really responsible registries and registrars out there. It's not just PIR. There are registries and registrars that are interested in growing in a really responsible way. The other thing you have to remember too is DNS abuse. It's got a cost, not just a reputational cost, but a man-hour cost in reviewing things. So to the extent registries and registrars implement something that reduces the likelihood of abuse up front, it may end up saving them money in the long run. Plus, they're growing their registration base. So it may not work for a registrar or registry that has their whole business model is centered around deep discounts and just volume. Yeah. It would have to be a pretty fundamental change for an organization like that to embrace something like QPI. But I think it would work on a lot of levels. In particular, when we say registrars, there's registrars out there that are exclusively wholesale registrars. They could copy and paste and apply QPI to their reseller channel in an instant. So it works. To me, I think it would work exactly as well from the registry to the registrar as it would a wholesale registrar to its reseller partners. Oh, and I do see Rudy's question relates to new TLDs on the impact of the root zone and how do I see the root zone changing as the rooms in the future. Admittedly, Rudy, I'm just a lawyer and abuse guy and not technically experienced enough to speak to the root zone issues. So I appreciate the question. It's interesting, but admittedly, I don't think I've got the qualifications to speak to it.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Alfredo. Are you there? I think Alfredo had.
Yes, okay. I'm here.
Okay, so we're wrapping up. That was our last question. Thank you, Rudy, for that question. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Alfredo.
Thank you, Glenn. Brian, it has been a privilege to have you on this call, and you gave great insights at what .org does for the internet end users and implementing some new strategies to enforce and remediate the DNS abuse that we all encounter. I want to thank Paul, it's on the call, and you as well, for the sponsorship you have given us to start this project, and hopefully we'll be able to keep on doing it for the future. Some participants have asked questions related to what's to come in the future. Well, you'll just have to wait and see. We have great plans, but we need your support and we need your word of mouth. So share your experiences in this School of Internet Governance call, and we hope to see you in some other course that we might develop in the future. Back to you, Glenn, for the last words.
Great. Thank you all for coming today. As we've said, next session will be Joanna on, again, legal. And she's going to be talking about cross jurisdiction. She's going to be talking about legislation and initiatives that go across national boundaries. So she's a great speaker. She's a very active person with as an ALAC member, and she's also been very active on security issues, believe it or not, with IGF. So look forward to that. And those who are not coming to the call, we always make the videos available within about an hour on the site. We also post it on our Facebook site and also on our playlist on YouTube. So again, thank you everybody for coming today. It's been a great session. And again, we'll see you online with the live chats and discussions. And please carry on. If there's any resources you guys think is valuable for this session or other sessions, you have a form to fill out, and we'll see you or hear each other next Monday. Again, thank you again.
Have a great day. Stay well and safe. Bye to all.
Bye, everybody.